Indeed, the LIV requirements for their players have a similar bar to any of them saying anything negative about any relevant person, including members of the PIF governing apparatus. And so I'm going to end my questioning now, but for this round, but I would like to have a commitment from both of you that the final agreement will not prevent players or PGA Tour executives from commenting on or criticizing actions of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Will you make that commitment?
That will certainly be an objective we would seek, Senator, and I would add that the framework agreement does not prevent our players from speaking their mind on any matters. They're open.
It doesn't now, but you can't commit that the final agreement will not require them to avoid any such disparaging statement?
We do not anticipate it having that.
You don't anticipate it? Will you commit that it won't have it, that you will not agree to it if it does?
I wouldn't recommend it to the policy board for approval if it did.
Mr. Dunn?
As I'm not doing the negotiation, but as Ron just said, he wouldn't recommend it. I will inform the entire board of your excellent point, and it won't. You know, I'll guarantee you the board will vote on it. I don't have the power to decide that, but we hear you, we understand, and I'll advocate for it. If we get to an agreement, and that disparagement that is basically to the term of the agreement. So you generally don't want to be saying bad things about each other when you're negotiating, but it has a short-term life on it till we get to a definitive.
I'll return to this line of questioning when I continue. Ranking member is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to just try and lay out the reality that you were faced with. First of all, you would not have been seeking large additional funding or large amounts of additional funding had it not been for the PIF entering the scene, correct? I mean, you're always seeking resources, that type of thing, but it's only because of what the kingdom did, correct?
That's correct, Senator Johnson. It's only because of LIV that we're sitting here today.
And again, you're dealing with an entity that's 500 times larger than you in terms of financial wealth. Mr. Dunn, who is Roger Devlin?
I've never met a Roger Devlin. He has emailed me. He is a member of a golf club over in England. He works, I believe, as in investment banking capacity, and he had emailed me a couple times about possible discussions about getting together.
I believe he had helped Saudi Arabia invest in some soccer team or whatever.
I believe his partner is one of the co-investors with Yasser.
So
That's
he had a
correct.
relationship with the Saudis,
He
a
did.
commercial one.
He does, to my knowledge.
He reached out to you in January saying, you know, the time may be ripe to sit down and try and repair the breach. And you rebuffed him at that point in time. You weren't ready for it. Is that a fair statement?
If I may answer, Senator, my attitude was all of the people other than the guy with the money we shouldn't talk to. We should just get to the spiritual leader. And because everything that was happening didn't make any sense to me. So I didn't want to waste any time talking to anybody, and my advice to the commissioner was don't waste any time talking to anybody other than the guy with the money.
And who's that guy with the money in your mind?
The governor, Yasser al-Rahman.
Okay. On April 14th, 2023, Mr. Devlin emailed you, and the final line in his email states, I fear the Saudis will double down on their investment and golf will be split asunder in perpetuity. I mean, I read that and I recognize what reality the PGA was facing. I mean, is that kind of typify one of the reasons you decided to reach out to the Saudis?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. They didn't have to double down to create the problem that we already had. So if they just kept doing what they were doing, it would be significant enough because the PGA Tour it's not that big in terms of players. So if they take 5 players a year, in 5 years, They can gut us.
Again, the PGA was facing existential threat because of the PIF and because of LIV. So you're responding to that existential threat. So now you've agreed to reach out to Yasser Al-Rumayyan. What did you make of the man? I mean, tell us a little bit, what was his motivation? I mean, I realize you can't necessarily get inside his head, but can you just kind of describe for us why were the Saudis doing this? Or why was Yasser doing this?
Well, thank you, Senator. Obviously, I'm not inside his head, but my perception, and as I said, I told the commissioner that you should send someone only to speak to him. And in April, he chose me to reach out to him. I went out to meet him, and unlike everyone else that is involved with LIV, where they're very acrimonious towards the PGA Tour, he said he respected the tour, respected how they did things, and I was surprised by that. He didn't have the attitude that, frankly, a lot of the management people had, and so I thought it might make sense to put the man with the money and our commissioner together for another meeting.
Describe the challenge you have as the PGA, compensating the top players, compensating everybody, and also attracting top players to come to your tournaments, which is what you need to attract the audience, the viewership, the TV deals, the sponsorship. Just talk about that challenge in general of managing just PGA Tour golf. Either one of you, whoever.
Yeah, I think Ron.
So we represent all the players. And so our, process we have to go through is allocating resources that the players earn through competition. We're performance-based, a pure meritocracy, as I think, as you said, Senator Johnson. And so we try to balance the allocation of resources among our top players and the ones who are performing at a top level on a regular basis, while at the same time maintaining earnings opportunities for all of our players. The players who are performing well, our top players, those are the ones that the fans are interested in, and fans tune in and watch, and they drive our primary revenue streams, media and sponsorship. And to the extent that LIV Golf has been successful in taking away some of our top players through their irrational, economic business model, that puts pressure on our ability to maintain our primary revenue sources. And if they continue to do that, we would, as you said, would have faced an existential threat.
Mr. Dunn, you've done a lot of deals, right? And you've been in a lot of negotiations. I've done a lot of negotiations myself. I've never had to do them in public. I want to emphasize for the committee, for the audience, that you don't have a deal. You've ended the litigation, which took a big liability off your plate. And I would certainly, I've been involved enough litigation that you never know the result. I mean, it's always a big risk, right? Talk about how difficult it is for the PGA to have all this information exposed. Ideas get thrown out in negotiation. They're rejected. But even the idea being made public is not helpful. Describe how difficult it's going to be to conclude this deal.
It makes it very complicated. I agree. You generally don't negotiate a deal in public, but we're committed to try to move from a framework agreement to a definitive agreement, because we believe that will allow us to continue our leadership in professional golf and our tournaments to be operated in accordance with our mission and our standards for our players and for charity. We think that's very important, but these proceedings make that even more difficult.
Mr. Price, as we spoke over the phone a couple of weeks ago, and I read the framework, which immediately got leaked, it struck me as this is a kind of a win-win situation for the parties involved. They basically, it sounds like the Saudi got a seat at the table in terms of golf, but PGA retained its control over the game, over the competition. Mr. Dunn, can you just kind of speak to this? I mean, in any negotiation, what you want in the end is a win-win for everybody, and you can move forward successfully, as opposed to acrimony and destructive behavior moving forward.
Senator, that's the goal. I really understand Senator Blumenthal's concern about not having them take over. That's the last thing in the world we want. It's just, and I think through this agreement, we can get a win-win situation. My fear is if we don't get to an agreement, they're already putting billions of dollars into golf. They've got a management team that wants to destroy the tour. And even though you could say take 5 or 6 players a year, they have an unlimited horizon and an unlimited amount of money. So it isn't like the product is better. It's just that there's a lot more money that will make people move. And that's, I'm concerned with exactly what the senator is worried about. I'm more concerned, though, if we do nothing, we're going to end up there. They're going to end up owning, if we don't, if they can do it. Because it isn't that big. It's only a couple hundred players.
I share that concern.
And I'm deeply concerned.
And I sympathize with the position you're both in. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Johnson. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll try to be quick, both out of respect for other members, but also have a presiding officership that begins in a few minutes. But I can't help but observe that there's a lot of conversation about what this means from the PGA leadership's perspective, what this could potentially mean from a PIF perspective in Saudi Arabia itself. I don't hear a lot of conversation about the players, because the players' performance that drives the game. It's the players' performance that drives the fan base. It's the players' performance that drives the revenues. So I want to take a moment to focus on the players and the need to do right by them should this agreement actually be concluded. Now, as we all know, prior to the framework that was announced, the PGA Tour's officials were highly critical of LIV and those who chose to join LIV. In fact, I understand that the PGA Tour suspended at least 24 players who participated in LIV events and declared them ineligible to participate in PGA Tour tournaments. Of course, PGA officials then turned around and did exactly the same thing they criticized some players for, leaving those players who chose to remain loyal to the PGA and forego the significant financial benefits of joining LIV, understandably wondering what was the point of remaining loyal to the PGA. So, Mr. Dunn, can you tell me how will players who remained loyal to the PGA be made whole? Will they be eligible for some form of damages? And it's not just the foregone income that was a real pain, but their reputations even taken a hit. Can you explain to me how players are going to be made good should this agreement go through?
It's really, but I'll answer. But Ron is really doing the negotiation. But thank you for your question, Senator. Nothing will happen without the players' fully support. We have 5 player representatives on the Tour Policy Board. I can't imagine the circumstance where I won't be voting with the majority of them. So, and I have to emphasize, we negotiated the settlement of the lawsuit in complete secrecy because of the fear that a lot of people make a lot of money in these lawsuits, especially the other side's lawyers. So to the degree that got out, we would never have gotten that to fruition. All that we have done, and it's a 2-stage negotiation, a little bit of what Senator Johnson was talking about. First, the first part is lawsuit settles, Tour has to be in charge, and we'll agree to talk. Now we're talking with complete transparency. So the players are going to have to get something that they appreciate for staying on the tour.
I hear you. Time is limited. As we turn over to Mr. Price for your remarks, let me also add in the dimension of, for the new players that were now eligible to compete in the PGA because there was a handful that left to LIV, what happens to them after this merger if it goes through?
Senator, we've got 2 task forces in place now, and we're working with our player directors because we're a membership organization. That's who we represent. And the first task force is evaluating ways in which we can recognize the players who remain loyal to the PGA Tour. That's very important to us. We will not move forward with a definitive agreement unless we get that right and our players support that. For players who left the tour to play for LIV, they were suspended. If they come back, they're not going to be playing for LIV. They'll be playing for a PGA Tour controlled sports league or golf league. And they will have to go through our existing rules and regulations process to gain re-entry to the PGA membership.
No, that's one of the areas that we'll be watching. The second, Mr. Chair, instead of asking an additional question, I'll just state a concern for the record, and we'll follow up in future conversations here. But during the 2023 season, LIV Golf pulled a bait and switch, from what I understand, on its television broadcast technicians, who are represented by the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, when they switched to a non-union production company, and making the technicians behind LIV Golf's production some of the few in major sports who do not receive any health and retirement benefits while providing coverage. So while my first question was about the players specifically, please know I'm interested in the treatment and fairness of all employees that make golf revenues, including but not limited to significant broadcast revenues possible, not just as players, but in the broadcast, the production, et cetera. So yet another area that we'll be following up on. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Padilla. Senator Paul.
I've been a vocal critic of the Saudis for years and led the effort to block billions in arms sales to Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have demonstrated a relentless pattern of malign behavior, ranging from the brutal killing and dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi within their consulate, for which they evaded punishment, and their consistent disregard for human rights is well known. Additionally, they have committed war crimes in Yemen, a war for which American taxpayers are being used as unwitting accomplices, resulting in thousands of civilian casualties from their ruthless actions. Nevertheless, I see no constitutional power that suggests Congress should involve itself in golf. I have no doubt that some will argue that the tax code or somewhere in the ever-expansive Commerce Clause is the power to regulate private agreements. I disagree. As an originalist interpretation of the Constitution would lead to a different conclusion. If we took the Ninth Amendment seriously, if we took the principles of liberty, of contract seriously, we would acknowledge that the Constitution affords protection for such agreements. We have no business asking the PGA about their negotiations or what they might do or what they might do. It's not the business of government. If members of the Senate wanted to express their outrage over Saudi Arabia in a meaningful way, I gave them an opportunity to do so. In December 2021, I proposed canceling $650 million sale of 280 advanced air-to-air missiles and 596 missile launchers to Saudi Arabia, but there was no congressional hearing. We're here today talking about golf, but we didn't have one congressional hearing over sending hundreds of millions of dollars of advanced weapons to Saudi Arabia. There was no expression of outrage. Instead, 67 senators voted against my proposal and voted to continue selling arms to Saudi Arabia. It's time that Congress rediscovers the presumption of liberty, that our first recourse is to defend the unenumerated rights of private actors, not to expand our few and defined powers to regulate anything we may personally dislike. As a member of this institution, I find no grounds for government to be involved in the game of golf. But are there legitimate questions? Could we have legitimate hearings? Are there things we should be discussing? Of course. Do the 9/11 victims have a legal obligation owed to them by the Saudi Arabian government? It's a real question. Should we be involved with selling arms to Saudi Arabia? A real question. Should be debated, and we should have votes on these things. Should we be involved in the war in Yemen? Nobody in Congress ever voted to go in war in Yemen. Why the hell are we involved in that war? Furthermore, with regard to sports, there is a valid discussion that should be going on, and we should have a discussion of, and that's the antitrust involvement in sports. I think like most antitrust, it's topsy-turvy. It's flipped upside down. It's doing the wrong thing. PGA mentioned they have some rules. You join the PGA, you got to obey some rules to be part of the PGA. If you don't obey those rules, they should have the right to exclude you. That's what associations are about. If you don't allow them to have rules, the court has totally screwed this up, and Congress has let them. The court ruled unanimously that the NCAA can't invoke their rules. And so they've completely screwed up college athletes. We used to be proud. Many of us loved watching amateur athletes that weren't paid. Now everybody that plays basketball in college is going to be driving a Bentley or a Rolls. I mean, we're going to be seeing rap stars instead of basketball stars. I mean, this is crazy. But you know why it happened? Because Congress sat around and said, oh, well, because of antitrust, we can't let the NCAA do it. It went to the court, and the court made the ruling, unfortunately, a unanimous ruling based on the law. So the law's got to change. Antitrust shouldn't be involved with associations, shouldn't be involved with the PGA, shouldn't be involved with the NCAA. For the most part, antitrust in our country actually does the opposite of what it is intended to do. I'll give you another example. As a physician, if 5 physicians get together and say, we don't like Blue Cross paying us $80 and we want to get $100 an exam from Blue Cross or from United or from Humana, from some billion-dollar company, do you know what antitrust does? Antitrust sues 5 doctors and says you can't talk about this. It's ridiculous. Antitrust is actually protecting the big people versus the small people. But it's a unique situation to talk about associations, particularly sports associations. Antitrust should let sports associations. You don't have to join PGA. You don't have to join a sports association. You can be outside the NCAA, but the only way they had power was because they had the power of a large body and there was prestige in being part of the NCAA. All of that's gone. It's the wild, wild west, and nobody knows what's going to happen with college sports, but nobody's really happy about it. You know, there always are professional sports, and as someone who grew up in a sport that wasn't one where you were well remunerated, I understand the idea of trying to allow some contracts. There were some in-betweens on these things. You know, for swimmers don't really have professional sports. But at the same time, there was a way to probably do this that could have been done through the NCAA, but the courts gutted the NCAA and Congress sat by and watched this. So there are legitimate concerns that we could look into as Congress, but I don't think it's a legitimate concern to berate private individuals over contracts, to get involved and say, well, what are you going to do? Will you promise me the contract won't do this? That's not the role of government to tell people, oh, you can't make a contract doing this. No, in a free country, you make contracts. They're the business of the people making contracts, and government shouldn't be involved in this at all. So I see a certain illegitimacy to the whole proceeding today. Valid questions about Saudi Arabia that should be addressed, but we're not addressing the valid things because we have a show trial basically of a private organization, which I think is inappropriate.
Thank you, Ranking Member Paul. I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair to address at least the legal issue that you've raised, the constitutional question. Congress's authority to investigate here and investigate golf comes from Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which gives us the power to lay and collect taxes and to regulate and therefore investigate interstate commerce. I don't need to tell anyone in this room, golf is a $100 billion industry. Mr. Dunn himself has referred to the billions of dollars, 3.6 billion, I believe, that the PGA Tour has provided to charity. In my own state, the Travelers Championship brings $60 million to my state annually and millions of dollars to local charities. The PGA Tour has a major impact on our economy, our way of life, our image in this country, our self-image and our image abroad. The PGA Tour also derives tremendous benefits from tax laws established by Congress because it operates as a 501c6, not-for-profit entity, and that provision of law has received little scrutiny. This inquiry may lead to close scrutiny of 501c6. A study conducted in 2013 found that this benefit was worth at least $200 million to the tour between 1993 and 2013. Congress has a long history of conducting oversight on matters related to sports. I've participated in a number of them involving the NCAA, domestic violence in the NFL, doping in Major League Baseball, sexual assault in women's gymnastics, and anti-competitive practices in multiple sports. But most importantly, as I said in my opening remarks, this hearing and our investigation is ultimately not about golf. We're here because we're concerned about the PGA Tour's deal in terms of what it means for an authoritarian government to use its wealth to capture American institutions, because we are an open society. And I've joined Senator Paul in many of his amendments, advocacy, and so forth involving the Saudi government, and I appreciate much of what he has said about it. But I do think that there is not only a legitimate role here, an imperative role for this committee and the United States Congress. Senator Scott?
Point of inquiry? Point of inquiry?
Yes, sir.
Nothing in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution allows Congress to intervene or involve itself in private contractual negotiations.
Well, if that's an inquiry, the answer is nothing explicitly authorizes intervention. But as you well know, antitrust law, consumer protection law, many other laws involve protection of public interests and individual interests because the public interest demands it. Senator Scott.
Sure. I didn't get to participate in the whole hearing. I have to go to another hearing. But first off, thank you for being here. You're a great Florida company. As you know, golf is really important to our economy. I can't imagine doing what you're doing, trying to negotiate a deal when you have cameras in front of you. My prior life was negotiating deals and doing deals, and you'll never get it. It's very difficult to get a deal done that way. So I think that's pretty frustrating for you guys. But could you talk about, just take a state like Florida or any other, you can pick any other state, the importance of what golf is doing from a charity standpoint, from a building a global brand standpoint, and how important what golf has become to this country?
Senator Scott, I'll be happy to speak to that, and I'm happy to tell you that in addition to the PGA Tour being headquartered in Florida and our flagship Tournament Players Club, TPC Sawgrass, being there, we conduct 10 tournaments in your state. Those tournaments generate over $30 million for charity annually. Cumulatively, our tournaments in the state of Florida have generated over $800 million for charity, and our annual economic impact in Florida is over $800 million. And importantly, those are the type of things that we're trying to protect, our ability to do that. If we can move from the framework agreement to the definitive agreement, in which the PGA Tour has absolute control, we'll be able to continue to do that. And we'll be able to expand our economic impact in Florida and across the nation. We're in 34 states now. We have an economic impact of over $4 billion. We think we can grow that significantly if we can reach the definitive agreement.
Yes, thank you, Senator Scott. And, I think golf is a force of good. I think if people get to know each other and play golf, I think it will solve a lot of problems. And I think to the degree that golf is a global game, it's incumbent on all of us to try to reach out and try to avoid things. And maybe there's a possibility of meeting people with different faiths, different religions, different colors, that we can get to know better, and maybe we can have a better world. That's how I look at it.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for being here. Good luck.
Senator Marshall?
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our guests. When I think about life at this level, typically motivations are sex, money, or power. And as we look at this merger, I'm trying to figure out why. Where's the money? Where's the power? So I'll start with you, Mr. Price. Who is losing out on money and who's losing out on power in this deal?
Thank you, Senator. And so we had two options. One was being in a situation of where we faced the threat of professional golf being taken over by LIV Golf, which is 100% funded by the Public Investment Fund.
That, right?
The second option is for the PGA Tour to continue to lead professional golf, operated in accordance with our.
So specifically who? Who is going to be making less money and who's going to have less power because of this merger? Someone is losing out. I would assume that's why we're here today.
Senator, I would describe it as a situation of where the PGA Tour stays in the same position that it's in. Our players and our charities win. I don't know that anyone is losing. I think it benefits all of our
There's
constituents.
no individuals that'll be losing because of this financially.
No, sir, because we're healing a fracture in professional golf.
Okay. Mr. Dunn, same question for you, I guess, is who's losing out? Who's the loser in this? Who's losing money? Who's losing power?
It's a very good question, Senator. The Tour Golf is the winner because we continue to uphold the standards and traditions of the meritocracy. Professional golf is hard. You have to really work hard. It's fragile. You have windows.
So in your opinion, there's no private investors. I don't understand the complexity of your nonprofit organization, but there's no individuals that'll be losing money because of this. You don't think no individuals losing any power?
The lawyers will lose money. Absolutely. I mean, because that's
it's the end of the
$100
lawsuit.
million a year. I mean, between everybody.
Okay. Who has the most to gain from a power and a financial? I'll just stick with you, Mr. Dunn. Who's gaining from this financially and with power?
I'm sorry, you're asking me?
Yes.
I think the PGA Tour definitely stays intact and becomes more powerful. And I hope that in a more constructive way, Yasser gets a more productive role in the game of golf, because I think the PGA Tour product is vastly superior. That's my opinion.
Thank you. Mr. Price, who do you think gains the most from this financially and control?
Thank you, Senator. I firmly believe it's the PGA Tour's constituents, our players, our fans, our sponsors, and charity all clearly win under the framework agreement if we can reach a definitive agreement.
Okay. I'm sure this question has been asked earlier. I've been in another committee, but as I review this, the document provided us, a lot of this was done in the dark of the night, so to speak, and I think some of you, even your own members, were surprised when they saw this deal put together. So, Mr. Dunn, what was your reaction? Were you on the inside of when all this was happening? I don't recall.
Yes, Senator. I had originally reached out.
Okay, so you were from the beginning. How did some of your friends and long-term members react to this, to you personally?
Well, twofold. They were stunned, and the rollout was very misleading and inaccurate, which is everyone's fault. There is no merger. There is no deal. There is simply an agreement to try to get to an agreement and settle the lawsuits. So you had an initial surge of anxiety due to the ineffective, inaccurate rollout, and now it's settling into, there's nothing there yet, and we're having the reality of having to try to figure out something which is done in unbelievable transparency. You know, there's an issue about sometimes too many cooks in the kitchen. Well, in this case, everyone in the world is in the kitchen. So it's going to be difficult, but we're going to work hard at it.
Thank you for that answer. You know, today we're here on the subcommittee on investigation of the United States Senate Committee on Homeland Security and trying to figure out why this issue was raised to this level. I got to tell you, no one back home has asked me, hey, what's the Senate think about this merger? At the same time, every day somebody asks me, why were we funding viral gain-of-function research in Wuhan, China? They ask me, why is the CDC now pushing a medication that's not safe to be used to help biological men make a milk-like substance? The CDC in direct contradiction to the FDA. And they asked me about the president's son, and they were concerned that he's running a criminal enterprise out of the White House. And now more questions than answers on the cocaine found in the White House. Those are the questions that people ask me about. Why aren't we investigating them? I don't see if any of this is prudent to the daily lives of American working families who are paying twice as much for groceries and gasoline than they were 2 years ago. Many of you said that the LIV organization is the Saudis' way of sports washing, and I want to dig a little bit deeper into that. What was China doing when they hosted the Olympics but a few years ago, but sports washing? Trying to wash their enslavement of hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of Muslims. Trying to sports wash their purchase of thousands of United States farmland acres. To sports wash their research into bioterrorism weapons. Why aren't we investigating those issues? Why aren't we investigating that 90% of the counterfeits that come into this country are made in China? 90% of the fentanyl that comes into this country is made in China. They steal $500 billion of intellectual property from us every year. Those are the things that we should be investigating. Those are the things that Kansans want to know. I look forward to the day when we have honest discussions in this committee and our investigation powers to investigate our own out-of-control federal bureaucracy that actually impacts the American people. I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman, but I do want to wish the very best of success to Topeka, Kansas' own PGA great Gary Woodland. We're very proud of him. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Marshall. Senator Hawley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. I think I heard you testify to the chairman just a little bit ago that you may take $1 billion or more from the Saudis. Let's talk about some of the money that you've taken from communist China. Speaking of sports washing, what can you tell me, Mr. Price, about the PGA Tour China series?
The PGA, thank you, Senator. The PGA Tour China series was last operated in 2019. We have not operated it since then and have no plans to continue that series.
You don't have a PGA Tour in China at all right now?
We do not.
What about the PGA China Tour? Let's look at the quote here from Mr. Greg Gilligan. PGA Tour China is truly thrilled to be partnering with Shanghai Sports on the PGA Tour Series China. Shanghai is a world-class organization with great experience of connecting the expectations of international sports bodies with an understanding of the Chinese market. This isn't happening?
I'm not sure, Senator, what the date on that quote is, but we have not conducted the PGA Tour China Series since 2019.
But you just signed a 20-year agreement to conduct a tour series in China, correct?
It has not been conducted since 2019.
Did you take $45 million in financing from the Yao Group to conduct PGA Tour China?
No, sir, we did not.
Your spokesperson said, this is Laura Livesey, PGA Tour China is owned and operated by the PGA Tour and supported by the General Administration of Sports of China and the China Golf Association. So you're saying this doesn't exist anymore? When was it shut down?
It hasn't operated since 2019.
Did you return the money?
So we were not paid $45 million. I don't recall the specific details of the agreement. We received a sanction fee, as I recall, for the series of events, and there was an operator within China that actually operated the events.
So you're saying you don't know anything about this?
No, sir, I didn't say that. I just said it hasn't been operated since 2019, and I don't recall the specifics of the agreement, but I can certainly get those to you.
Well, I know the specifics of the agreement. Chinese private equity firm Yao Capital financed the PGA Tour Shanghai deal with $45 million investment. The Yao Capital firm has direct ties to the Chinese Communist Party. Does that concern you? Concerns me.
And Senator, we're not operating there anymore, and I believe I can get the details, but that money went directly to an operator in China, not the PGA Tour.
It was a deal between the PGA Tour and a Chinese company to do a series of events. You at least admit those events happened just a few years ago, right?
They did happen for a series of years.
Okay, so you're telling me that you're not going to do any further business in China, you've got no contracts with any Chinese entities, and you're not going to operate PGA events in China?
We have no plans to continue that series at this point in time.
And you're not going to operate any other series? You're not going to do anything in China? Do I understand you correctly?
We have no present plans to do that.
Has the PGA, given your past business relationships with Chinese entities? Have you taken a stance on the Uyghur concentration camps? Have you condemned the genocide there?
We do, Senator, we firmly support human rights, and we're very concerned about what's happened there, but we leave those types of government, but we certainly do not condone that type of activity.
Well, wait a minute. When you say you leave the matters to the United States government, I'm just asking you, will you speak out against the persecution and internment of Uyghurs in China? You've done business in China. You've conducted tour events in China. You've accepted money from Chinese entities in some form of a partnership. Do you condemn the concentration camps that currently, as we sit here and speak, are imprisoning Uyghurs, religious minorities, in that nation?
Senator, we certainly do not condone or support that type of activity. Yes, sir.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about your lobbying activity as it relates to the Saudi deal. Public reports say that you paid lobbyists last year in just one quarter of the year, 6 figures or more as to lobby Congress on the Saudi Golf League proposals. What was that related to?
Senator, we went to members of Congress as we faced a very threat to our existence to make them aware of what the Public Investment Fund was attempting to do through its operations of the LIV Golf Series.
And so make Congress aware and ask for what? What did you want this body to do?
Senator, anything that the Congress could do within its power to help preserve an American institution.
But this is before you agreed to take $1 billion from the same people that you were lobbying against a year ago.
Senator, we faced a choice. One was to allow professional golf to be taken over and operated by the Public Investment Fund of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The second was to allow the PGA Tour to continue to lead it in accordance with our mission and our values for the benefit of our players and charity.
Let me come back to, if I could, this issue with the PGA Tour of China series. Why didn't you disclose your activities and your partnership with Yao Capital and the Shanghai Group? Why didn't you disclose that on your Form 990? You're a tax-exempt organization, is that right? I think you testified to that effect.
501c6 tax-exempt organization.
Okay, so you have to file a Form 990, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
The Form 990 contains a Schedule F, is that correct?
Yes.
The Schedule F requires you to disclose any activities conducted overseas, including unrelated trade or business programs, services, fundraising activities, investments, or maintaining offices, employees, or agents for the purpose of conducting any such activities. Your Form 990s didn't disclose anything related to your dealings in China. Why not?
Senators, our intention is to fully comply with all the disclosure requirements on Form 990. If there's a disclosure requirement that we should have made that we didn't, we will get that corrected.
Were you attempting to paper over what you had done in China and your partnership with these Chinese entities?
Absolutely not, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Hawley. We're going to begin a second round of questions if any of our colleagues arrive in the meantime. We're also, I think, scheduled to have a vote at 11:30, so at some point we may have to take a brief recess. I want to come back to the disparagement issue and the non-disparagement agreement. And just so everybody understands, I get it that you don't feel you have a deal, but the litigation is gone, right?
Yes, sir.
It's history.
Yes,
So whatever threat LIV Golf represents to you, it's no longer the cost of litigation. Tomorrow, you could go through an IPO, you could go to private equity funders, you could go to the players if they wanted to own as well as be members of the PGA Tour. You have a lot of options right now, correct?
Senator, if we chose one of those options, we would still be facing a real threat that LIV Golf and the $700 billion public investment fund would continue to recruit our top players.
But Mr. Price, players have stood by you. Mr. Dunn himself, and I want to hold up this quote, which I think is so powerful, talking about Tiger Woods and the offer of $700 million? It takes a lot to say no to a bucket full of money. These players who stood by you are heroes. They deserve our thanks. And I am betting, because I never want to bet against America, that America will be on your side, thick or thin. Do you agree, Mr. Dunn?
Senator, it's an excellent line of questioning, and thank you for raising it. We're contractually obligated to try to see if we can come to a deal that makes sense. We'll meet all our obligations. As Senator Johnson and Senator Marshall have pointed out, that when it's in this massive transparency, it will make things difficult. If it ends up we don't get to an agreement, which is possible, LIV Golf will still be there. They'll still have a lot of money, and we'll have to do all the things you're talking about.
So you still have the choice to stand up against sports washing, against the Saudi monarchy, against the hundreds of billions of dollars, and maybe a lot more, that the Saudis will throw at you, and stand up for America, because America's going to stand up for you, and maybe you're contractually bound to give it your best efforts to reach an agreement.
Yeah.
But there is something that stinks about this path that you're on right now, because it is a surrender, and it is all about the money, and that's the reason for the backlash that you've seen, Mr. Price. The equity ownership interest that the Saudis will have, and that's a term from this agreement, gives them financial dominance. They control the purse string. And you may say that your objective is to prevent a non-disparagement clause, but as I read the disparagement clause, non-disparagement clause in this agreement, each party agrees and covenants that it will not at any time, directly or indirectly, make, publish, or communicate to any person or entity or in any public forum any defamatory or disparaging remarks, comments, or statements concerning the other party, their affiliates, and ultimate beneficial owners or the respective businesses, directors, employees, officers, shareholders, members, or advisors. That's about as broad a non-disparagement clause as I've ever seen. And I've been a law enforcer for most of my career as U.S. Attorney in Connecticut, as Attorney General of my state for 20 years, as a private litigator. You know, in 2019, General Manager Daryl Morley of the Houston Rockets tweeted support for Hong Kong. The NBA stood by him, even though China imposed significant economic costs on the NBA in an attempt to get the league to suppress his speech. Will you commit today, Mr. Price, that the PGA Tour will not punish any members who criticize the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia or human rights anywhere, regardless of this new relationship with PIF? Can you commit to the final agreement and that the PGA Tour will not punish anyone for criticism of anybody in Saudi Arabia?
Thank you, Senator. I can tell you that the framework agreement, under the framework agreement, our players are absolutely free to speak their mind without any cause for
Well, you might want
punishment by
to
the
check with
PGA Tour.
Governor Al-Ramayan, because you are a membership organization. Your commitment is on behalf of that organization. The athletes are members of it. You don't have to be a legal scholar to know that there is potential liability here.
Senator, our position is that the players are free to speak their mind under that agreement, and that's the way we would interpret it.
Will you commit to protect player expression? Go to court if necessary. Relitigate, sue PIF or anyone who tries to inhibit their speech.
Senator, we're a membership organization, and we always take our player interest very importantly, and we would try to protect their interest.
Well, you know, the answer to that question should be yes. We'll do it proudly. We'll protect our players.
We will protect our players proudly. And you asked me about the definitive agreement. We wouldn't recommend any definitive agreement to the board for approval that had such a clause in it.
Well, that is less than what I would like to see as a commitment here. Let me turn to some of the other questions that were raised. By the way, the agreement that has been put in the public realm is the result of your disclosing it, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so it's not like we ferreted it out or infringed on the privacy of your negotiations. You disclosed it voluntarily.
It was disclosed to this committee, and then we disclosed it. And
Well,
Senator, if I could just add one other
Sure.
thing with regard to, because I think, you know, there may not be a clear understanding with regard to control. We will not move, we do not have an agreement now. We only have a framework agreement. We will not move to a definitive agreement unless the PGA Tour is in complete control of the new entity, which will be a PGA Tour subsidiary controlled by the PGA Tour board and operated for the benefit of all of our constituents, our players, our fans, our sponsors, and our charity. If that's not where we end up, we will not even recommend approval, much less the board would not approve that.
I'm not here to argue with you or parse the terms of the agreement, Mr. Price, but the simple fact is that the Saudi government's the dominant owner here. It has the equity interest. It controls the purse strings. It has the money, and the money is the reason you surrendered in this agreement. And the money will be there going forward. $1 billion is just the beginning. So I think the American people can see through some of what you may be stating with the best of intentions. Let me follow up on a question that Mr. Hawley raised. Will you commit that you will have no PGA Tour events in China going forward?
Senator, I'm not in a position to commit the tour indefinitely, but we do not have anything planned for the foreseeable future.
That'll depend on what the new entity, the new co, decides.
The PGA Tour will have full control over that entity, and it will determine its schedule and where our tournaments are located, or otherwise we will not recommend approval of the definitive agreement.
Will you commit to have no PGA Tour events in Russia?
Senator, I can't commit the PGA Tour for the long term, but we certainly do not have any plans to conduct any events in Russia.
What are the current assets of the PGA Tour?
Our total assets are approximately $3 billion.
And
Net assets, the Senator Johnson referenced earlier, $1.3 billion.
I'm sorry, which figure is correct?
Net, the gross assets, approximately $3 billion. Net assets, Senator Johnson referenced earlier, are approximately $1.3 billion.
I have a breakdown for 2021 of the PGA's revenue. Maybe we can put that chart up. The PGA Tour brought in over $1.5 billion in revenue in 2021. Less than 3% of it, $43,694,020 was expensed as charitable grants. I don't mean to minimize that amount. It's a lot of money. But my question is, where did the rest of it go?
The rest of our revenue would have been in the cost to produce the revenue, and our largest cost is what we pay our players who compete for prize money through our tournaments.
How much of that money went to players?
And I'd have to check in 2021. I can tell you in 2023, we will distribute almost $1 billion to our players.
Out of how much revenue?
Our gross revenues in 2023 are approximately $2.1 billion.
And would it be fair to say that the remainder of that amount goes to produce the tournaments?
It's the cost of producing the tournaments, it's the cost of generating the revenues. There is charity distributed also. And if I could add, Senator, just for clarification, we are a 501c6 membership or trade association. Our mission is to generate economic opportunities for our players, but we have voluntarily structured our tournaments in a way so that the net proceeds of our tournaments go to charity. So in addition to what you had on that chart, there are tournaments who are given their net proceeds to tournaments because we partner with 501c3 organizations. That's how we generated over $215 million for charity last year and over $3.6 billion cumulatively.
And you own a number of the tournaments, like the Travelers in Connecticut you own, correct?
No, sir. We partner with a 501c3 organization who conducts that tournament.
You partner with them, but who owns the tournament?
We conduct the competition, but the local charity organization that we work with in Hartford sells the tickets, the hospitality, and sponsorship, and the net proceeds they generate, which are annually, I think, in the approximately $2 million, goes back to charity in the local Hartford community.
If this litigation is ended and your revenue is almost $3 billion a year, why do you need the Saudis' $1 billion?
We did not seek the Saudis. We were in a situation of where we faced a real threat of...
But you could go elsewhere for $1 billion, $3 billion, maybe $50 billion, correct?
We could, but if we went down that path, we would end up giving up total control of the PGA Tour. And this particular situation, not only did we preserve the Tour's future leadership of professional golf.
You could insist on the same requirements for independence of the Tour that you are insisting on, you say, from the Saudis.
We could potentially try that approach, but we would still face the threat of a $700 billion fund recruiting our players and operating a league in an irrational economic manner.
Well, again, I can only emphasize to you, Mr. Price, that your players, like Tiger Woods, gave up hundreds of millions of dollars. They stood strong. I hope the PGA Tour will as well. I may have more questions, but with
Senator,
apologies to my colleagues, I'm going to turn to Senator Johnson for his second round.
Let me first state, Mr. Chairman, I just don't think it's appropriate to be asking these representatives of the PGA to make assurances in terms of what they will and will not do. Obviously, they have to assure us that they'll follow the law. But exactly how they operate, they're a private organization. They have to deal with a complex set of issues in terms of running a league for the benefit of their players and, I would say, for fans. I think things have gotten muddled here. First of all, the PGA never would have sought
that's correct.
additional funding. You didn't need it. The only reason you're looking for funding from the PIF is an accommodation for PIF to have a seat at the table in running golf. If you don't offer them that seat, they'll take their $700 billion, a portion of that, and they will keep picking off players one by one until they destroy the game of golf at the highest competitive level. I mean, Mr. Dunn, isn't that how you see it?
Thank you, Senator. It's very important that we didn't decide one day we'll go over to Riyadh and bring these guys in here.
No, you were highly reluctant to reach out to them.
We got to the table because of the existence of LIV. They own 100% of LIV. They have billions of dollars in LIV. They have no economic constraint. They have no time constraint. So when you deal with a normal investor, they want to return quickly. They have a long horizon. I don't exactly know all their thought process, but they view it differently. They sued us. We did not decide to sue them. They took our players. Their entire existence is based on taking more of our players. That's just a reality. We're not complaining about it. That's what it is.
Well, first of all, you'd be justified in complaining about it. Okay, I mean, you faced an existential threat. You faced this for 2 years. You engaged in litigation, spent what, about $50 million just trying to defend yourself, and all of a sudden there was a way out of this.
Potentially.
There was a truce because of some favorable court hearings or rulings, but there was no guarantee that you were going to continue to win court rulings. You could have lost. Okay, and you know, I'll answer Senator Marshall's question from what I know. It seems like you've achieved in a really bad situation between a rock and a hard place. You actually carved out a win-win situation. Again, that's not to speak to the sport washing aspect of this and the concerns. And again, Mr. Dunn, if anybody has a concern of, you know, what happened on 9/11, it's you. You lost, again, 40% of your colleagues, your mentor in this. So we need to recognize the reality you face that you still face. There's no guarantee, there's no deal. There's no guarantee you're going to have a deal. If you don't get a deal, you'll have the Saudis willing to spend billions and billions, and at some point in time, players that were loyal to the PGA Tour will say, this isn't going away. I'm a chump for not expecting or for not accepting $10 million, $50 million, $100 million to go over to this league, and we'll just, you know, leave the PGA Tour behind. And now, rather than playing for the purity of the competition, for the title, it's just about money. It's like I make $10 million whether I win or not just by showing up. That destroys the game of golf. I mean, that's my perspective of this. I mean, can you tell me where I'm wrong or where I'm right?
You know, Senator, golf is a little different. You know, you gotta show up and dig it out of the ground. And Senator Blumenthal, I guess that quote I said, it takes a lot to turn down a lot of money. I think it was, if I recall, I think it was in reference to Tiger Woods. And he's the example of that. He digs it out of the ground. It's hard. It's hard to say no to all that. And we have a lot of unbelievably gutty guys that love the game that have said no, and we want to support them every way we can, one way or another. And we'll be there and we'll do that.
By the way, it sounds like the PIF, you know, reading the documents behind this, that they were recognizing the players that stayed true to the PGA Tour, and they're going to figure out some way to compensate that. I mean, I saw that in the documents. They were obviously aware of that, correct? So again,
yes.
I'm running out of time, but I want to underscore, you know, my concern about holding this hearing. And I could say a whole lot more, but I don't want to queer the deal. This is a delicate negotiation. There's nothing certain about this. Again, from what I see out of an awful situation, you know, Mr. Dunn, by you reaching out and, you know, the other people negotiating this are getting about as good a deal as we can expect that is about as win-win situation. Recognizing what Mr. Al-Rumayyan was looking for, a seat at the table, some saying how golf operates, but no control. You retain that control. So, you know, my suggestion, and again, I don't say that Congress doesn't have a role to play. We talked about that in terms of antitrust, and maybe once there's a deal to come back and take a look at this. But I mean, for the time being, Mr. Chairman, I would recommend we give these guys the space to negotiate something. Yeah, I think their motivations are pure. They're trying to preserve this game. They're trying to do right by their players. They're trying to do right by this country. Give them the space to negotiate a deal, and then if we have a problem with it, we can come back and look at it later. But You know, Mr. Price, Mr. Dunn, do you have any comments on that?
I agree with what you said, Senator Johnson. We're trying to negotiate a deal that preserves our leadership role in professional golf so that we can fulfill our mission for our players and charity. And if we cannot do that as we negotiate the deal, we won't recommend a definitive agreement for approval.
And again, if you don't get a deal, the Saudis will just keep pouring billions into this. Over time, those players have showed the loyalty to the PGA Tour will at some point in time say, I got to provide for family. You know, Mr. Dunn, you talked to me in my office. You know, golf, you're 2 bad swings away from losing the confidence to be able to compete at that high level. Pretty tenuous. So all of a sudden, a deal with the LIV could be pretty attractive.
Senator, you know, there's no denying that, and some players that have expressed that's a reality. It's hard. Professional golf's very hard, and if we're able to get to an agreement, definitive, and candidly, I appreciate Senator Blumenthal's concerns. We're all concerned about the same thing, and with that good guidance, it'll help us in the negotiation know what's important or not. But if we do get to an agreement, the players that stayed are gonna. We want to do everything we can for them, and we want to do everything we can for the game, and we want to do everything for the sponsors and the charities, and that's what we're trying to do. That's what we're really trying to do.
Well, again, I appreciate your challenge. I appreciate, you know, what you're up against, and I just wish you the best of luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You be successful. Thank you.
In the interest of, I have a number of responses, but in the interest of deference to my colleagues who are waiting to ask questions, I'm going to turn to Senator Carper.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, thanks so much for bringing us together here today. Mr. Dunn, Mr. Price, it's good to see you. Thank you for your time and for your input. As the former chairman of the committee, this committee, Homeland Security Committee, and as actually the ranking member of this subcommittee that's gathered here today, I hope that this is the first of a number of hearings that will provide our colleagues an opportunity to work together on a range of issues that will benefit the American people. Mr. Dunn, Mr. Price, again, we thank you for joining us in an effort to shine some light on a topic that's generated a whole lot of interest. And not just from Congress, but from sports fans and concerned citizens here at home and probably beyond our borders. The proposed framework agreement between the PGA Tour and Saudi-based public investment fund is a complex issue that will likely impact the game of professional golf for a long time, maybe decades to come, and may set a precedent for other sports professional leagues here in the United States. I'm aware that there are probably more questions than answers at this early stage, but I'm glad that we have an opportunity to start asking them today. I go back and forth on the train most nights to Delaware. It's an easy train ride, about an hour and a half, and my wife and I live there, and we oftentimes she'll say to me, like, what are y'all doing today? What are you working on today? At the end of the day, well, what happened? And she'll ask me, I'm sure when I get home tonight, well, what did you work on today? And she's from North Carolina. She was born in North Carolina. I was born in West Virginia. And an unlikely place to have an interest in golf, I would say. But there was a golfer there named Sammy Snead, who was before there was Jack Nicklaus, before there was Arnold Palmer. There was Sammy Snead. He was bigger than life in the state of West Virginia, where my sister and I were born. Later, we'd live in a place called Danville, Virginia. And my dad would actually take me with him to not to play golf, but to caddy. And they'd have a foursome to play every couple of weeks and weekends. And I would get to caddy and make a few dollars. And one day, one of the foursome didn't show up. And my dad said, how would you like to play golf? I was like 12 years old. And I got to use his clubs. They were, when I stood beside the golf clubs, they were as tall as me. And he made me count every stroke. I shot that day at 214. And but I was encouraged by my dad and the others who were playing golf that day, and said they thought I might have set some kind of record, which is probably true. But the next time I played, I cut 65 strokes off my score.
Good trend.
Could only do better. Could only do better. But there were talks, and the foursome, including my dad, that I was marked for greatness. The second Sandy Snead, that was not to happen. Still, I enjoy the game of golf, and I know, Mr. Price, Mr. Dunn, I know that you love the game of golf as well. I think that you and the PGA Tour can be proud of the values of the tour and the charitable mission of the tour. And in your testimony, I think you both state that the PGA Tour has contributed millions of dollars to charities local where tournaments are played, including in Wilmington, Delaware, which hosted just last year the B&W Championship. And on the LPGA side, we hosted for many years the ladies PGA Championship in Delaware, and raised a whole lot of money for a very good cause there in our state too. I'm told that the Evans Scholars Foundation in Delaware, which provides tuition and housing assistance for low-income college students who work as caddies, and they've received additional funding thanks to the effort that we're talking about here today. And I am grateful for the support that your organization has lent to our state and to countless others. Having said that, let me just say I'm concerned, as I'm sure you are too, that Saudi Arabia's human rights record runs counter to the tour's stated values of inclusion and respect. And my question, and as a result, I have maybe one question for both of you, but are you concerned that the proposed framework agreement will provide the Saudi Arabian government the opportunity to hide its human rights record behind the tour's values? Also, I know that my colleague, I think our chairman, Chairman Blumenthal, I may have touched on this issue earlier during the hearing. But if the proposed framework agreement becomes finalized, can you definitively, I'll just say, can you definitively tell us that the PGA Tour and its players will be able to speak freely about the human rights record of Saudi Arabia?
Thank you, Senator. And yes, I can tell you that if the framework agreement, if we move from a framework agreement to a definitive agreement, our players will be freely able to speak about Saudi Arabia. The PGA Tour fully supports human rights. We support, complete access to our game from all individuals, whether they're participating or attending our events. And the only way we will move forward with a definitive agreement, if the PGA Tour is in complete control and our tournaments continue to be operated in accordance with our mission and our values, which includes operated for our players, but also the charity, as you so appropriately mentioned, with the BMW Championship that was conducted in Wilmington last year.
All right, thank you. Mr. Dunn, you want to add anything to that?
Senator, I completely, obviously support both what you said and what Ron said. Critical is this, in this framework agreement, and the hope towards the definitive agreement is the control. And we absolutely agree with what you said, and we wouldn't go ahead with, I mean, it's not going to get any support without it.
All right, thank you both. My time's expired. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Carper. I'll recognize colleagues for a second round if you wish to use the time. Senator Marshall.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and Senator Carper, thank you for your thoughtful questions as always and the wisdom that you always pass on. I want to go back to the antitrust issue just for a second. I'm not an attorney. I'm trying to understand the process, but it's my understanding the PGA Tour was under some type of an antitrust issue investigation. As you were going forward, what type of advice were your attorneys giving you if you did this merger? Is it going to increase or decrease your risk of exposure to an antitrust issue? Mr. Price.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, we were undergoing an investigation with regard to our regulations and how they applied to the players that we had suspended who joined the LIV Golf League. We have been notified that the antitrust regulators are also going to look at our framework agreement, and we plan to fully cooperate with that investigation. But we do see this, if we're able to move from a framework agreement to a definitive agreement, it's going to heal a fracture in golf. The fracture in golf could have led to less fan interest and, a decreased product and opportunities for all professional golfers. We think as a result
But my
of
question is, will this increase or decrease your antitrust risk? Is that what the attorneys are giving you any advice, this merger?
the regulators are certainly taking a look at it. We believe that it should not violate the antitrust rules, but we plan to fully cooperate with that investigation.
Thank you, Mr. Price. Let me go to Mr. Dunn again. Would it be fair to say that some golf venues benefit from the traditional PGA Tour and other golf venues were benefiting from the new LIV tournaments going on? Mr. Dunn.
Thank you, Senator. I want to make sure I understand. So definitely where the PGA Tour is, the local communities, as Senator Blumenthal talked about in Connecticut, they by intention, design, total focus, they will definitely benefit.
And the same is true for the LIV venues as well, that those venues were making money.
I think they get paid money. I don't know if the crowds are quite the same.
Right. As you all were concerned about LIV going forward, was there any particular venues that were often talked about that there was concern about where the LIV was playing, or any type of money concerns from the venue locations?
You're asking me, Senator?
Yes.
That never came up in any single discussion that I ever had with anyone, but I'm not privy to every discussion. But there was no discussion about coveting or not desiring any LIV. Everything was about our players, our fans, our sponsors. How can we get to something that will work for everybody? We never discussed where they play. We don't,
Mr. Price, were there any discussions at your level about concern where the LIV venues were and going forward where these venues might be?
No, sir. Certainly nothing I was aware of. I agree with Jimmy in that the focus was on LIV and what they were doing to try to recruit our players.
And they're your players?
Yes. Well, they're former PGA Tour members, and so they were our players before they left to go join LIV.
Okay. Are they contractors for you all? Do they work for you all? Do they?
They are independent contractors, so they can. They don't have to play in all of our events, but our regulations, stipulate that they can't play for a competing league unless they get a conflicting event release. These players did not. These are regulations. We're a membership organization. Those are regulations that were developed by the members themselves, and so they're free to go pay for another league. They just can't go back and forth.
Okay, thank you. I'll close with this on a positive note. Mr. Dunn.
Yes, sir.
I feel your compassion, your passion. We never met before, but your compassion for this game of golf. Tell me why. Why do you love this game? What's important to you about it?
It's a good question, Senator. You have your faith, your family, and your friends, and golf has made a huge difference in my life. My father always talked about there were three important things. Number one, get to the best college you could get into. Two, marry the right woman. And three, get good enough at golf so you weren't scared to death on the first tee. And that's, other than health, faith, family, friends, if you do that, it'll be all right. And I've made so many friends and been into so many situations, including today, less enjoyable, but it is an experience, and I'm a very proud American, and I know it's not ideal, but I'm pretty proud to be in front of senators, and the game of golf is it's hard to really dislike somebody you play golf with, and I think golf is a global sport. We're reaching out to all parts of the world. And I think the more people that do it, the better chance we have for a better world.
Senator Hawley is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Price, I just want to come back to the answers that you gave me regarding PGA Tour in China, make sure that I understand where this rests currently, what the current status is. So let's see if I've got the facts right. In 2018, the PGA Tour announced a 20-year agreement for a new entity called PGA Tour China Series. 20-year agreement. This is what your spokesperson said about it just as recently as last year, 2022. Quote, the PGA Tour established a separate entity based in Beijing, China. Continuing, the PGA Tour Series China is owned and operated by the PGA Tour and supported by the General Administration of Sport of China, that's the Chinese government, and the China Golf Association. Now, you're telling me that this entity no longer exists?
Senator, I would have to get the facts for you on PGA Tour of China. I can give
Well, I thought you said to me just a little bit ago, I thought you said that you did one event in 2019 and it doesn't exist anymore.
From an event standpoint, that series has not operated since 2019.
Because of COVID.
It has not operated because of COVID, and we have no plans to continue that tour.
Because of COVID? Because just as recently as last year, you had events scheduled in China. You had to ultimately cancel them because of COVID, but that doesn't sound to me like you suspended your business arrangement.
I would have to check the status of the contract, Senator, but it's my understanding we have no
No,
plans
just wait a minute, though. This is important, because you told me just a minute ago when I talked about PGA Tour Series China that wasn't happening, that was gone. But now you're telling me something different. Now you're telling me that, oh, no, we still have the business arrangement. Actually, you're hemming and hawing on that. But you're saying we haven't done any events in China. Well, of course not, because of COVID restrictions. You haven't been allowed to. I'm trying to ascertain whether you still have this 20-year agreement with Chinese entities to do tour events in China. You had PGA Tour officials living in China in order to facilitate this. Do you see what I'm driving at? So my question is, does PGA Tour China, this entity that the tour owns, based in Beijing, for which you've signed a 20-year contract, does it still exist?
I can tell you two things. One is I would have to check the status of the contract. I do not believe it's currently in force, but I would have to check that, and we'll be happy to get you information on that. The second thing I can tell you is that we haven't operated since 2019, and it's my understanding that we have no plans to continue that series.
As long as COVID exists, or
Period.
And why is that?
From a business standpoint, we're not going to continue that series in China.
Okay. I think you can see what my concerns are, but just so that I'm absolutely crystal clear about it, here's my concern.
Yes.
My concern is that the communist government in China has systematically attempted to use and influence American sports organizations and lots of other entities, our media, entertainment industry, companies, lots of them. They're not shy about using leverage. And we've used the term sports washing a lot today, and I think it's applicable on this situation. And Senator Blumenthal referenced earlier the brutal crackdown in Hong Kong, which I guess I'll call it the privilege. Maybe it's the misfortune of seeing for myself firsthand on the streets there. And while that was going on, what was China doing? What was Beijing doing? They were applying maximal pressure on the NBA that had a lot of contracts very lucrative with China. The chairman mentioned Daryl Morey, at the time general manager of the Houston Rockets, who ventured the most, frankly, anodyne statement in support of the people of Hong Kong. I mean, it was the most moderate little, I think it was a tweet. For this, he was blasted by NBA players, certainly by China, by owners, by his own owner. Ultimately, he resigned. So it worries me when I see the PGA doing business with the Chinese government, subjecting its players and this association that you've lauded so much today to those same pressures from a government that is brutal, that is repressive, and that is attempting to use American institutions as a megaphone for their own totalitarian, dystopian, and frankly evil policies. When you imprison millions of people in concentration camps for the purpose of eradicating their religious beliefs and killing them, and that's what they're doing with the Uyghurs, you're an evil regime. When you treat your own people as slaves, and that's what they're doing, you are an evil regime. I don't want to see American institutions co-opted by that regime. That's where I'm coming from with this. I would hope we'd share that perspective. So I look forward to your responses in writing as to the status of your business agreement. I continue to be interested as to why on your Form 990 in both 2018 when this deal was announced and in 2020 after your event, this wasn't disclosed. I'd like to know why that is. And I'd like your assurances that your commitment that you're not going to restart this series in China and you're not going to conduct business operations with millions of dollars in financing from Chinese entities. Will you give me that commitment?
Senator, be happy to give you the information on the status of our contract in China, and I'll certainly follow up with you with regard to the disclosures in the 990. You know, as I've stated, we have no intentions of continuing that series from my perspective, and I can't commit the tour for the long term. I'm not in a position to do that. But there's nothing in the short term or immediate future that, from a tournament standpoint, that we're considering doing in China.
I would just say finally, Mr. Chairman, that I think that the era in which institutions, sports leagues, businesses, when they say it with regard to communist China, that, well, we leave the politics to other people, we just don't take any position on issues, I think that time has passed. When you have a government that is as oppressive and imperial as that government is, and is doing to its people what that government is, and has designs to do to others around the world what that government wants to do, I think it's time for American companies, American institutions to stand up and be counted. And I hope that the PGA will. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Hawley, and that is exactly why we're here today. That is why we are conducting this investigation and why we will broaden it as appropriate to include other institutions and other repressive regimes and their potential impact on our institutions, whether it's corporations or sports organizations. And I would just say, recently at the Qatar World Cup, FIFA prohibited players from wearing armbands with rainbow flags. We don't know whether Qatar imposed this requirement on FIFA or if FIFA just wanted to avoid controversy when it made its own deal with a repressive government, but the effect had a ban on free expression. This effort to restrict, punish, torture, imprison, kill people who stand up for their beliefs is a growing worldwide phenomenon. And I would hope that it would unite us on a bipartisan basis. Can you commit, Mr. Price, that the tour would never agree to a similar restriction if Saudi Arabia, which has a particularly troubling record on LGBTQ rights, wanted you to do it?
Senator, we believe in full access to our events. From a participation standpoint, from an attendance standpoint, we don't believe in any restrictions on that. If we
So
reach,
is the answer yes?
Senator, we
control. You would never agree to it. You would never punish your players. You would reject Saudi Arabia or the governor of the Sovereign Wealth Fund if they sought to impose that restriction, and you would never impose it yourself.
We would never impose it, and we determine where our events are played, and we would not conduct tournaments under those rules.
So you wouldn't do it in Saudi Arabia?
Not according to those rules.
Let me ask you, I mentioned earlier the side agreement, the apparent side agreement involving Greg Norman. Was that ever executed?
No, sir.
Is it your understanding that there is an agreement that he will no longer have his present position? That's in the talking points that you prepared for Mr. Monahan.
Yes, sir. Under the framework agreement, if we are able to move to a definitive agreement and it's approved, the LIV Golf assets, for which Greg Norman's currently the commissioner, will move into a new subsidiary, PGA Tour subsidiary, controlled by the PGA Tour. And those events will be managed by the PGA Tour. We have a complete infrastructure in place to manage events. It would make no sense to bring in that type of an executive to manage what is now a 14 series of events.
So just to be clear, he's out of a job.
If we reach a definitive agreement, we would not have a requirement for that type of position.
Our review of internal documents indicates that there are other understandings and agreements. Would you tell us about them?
I'm not aware of any other understanding or agreements that's not reflected in the framework agreement, which is still to be negotiated. Everything's to be negotiated.
What are the other side agreements or informal understandings?
I'm not aware of any other side agreements or informal understandings.
Is that because you're not permitted to talk about them, or because there are none absolutely?
None exist to my knowledge.
Okay. Let me ask you, when were you first informed about these negotiations that have been described by Mr. Dunn and the documents?
Senator Commissioner Monahan informed me shortly before the London meeting that we might have an opportunity to engage with the Public Investment Fund to settle the litigation and potentially to establish a framework where the PGA Tour would be in a position to continually professional golf.
Were any of the other independent directors on the board informed about the conversations or negotiation?
Senator, our director, Jimmy Dunn, was obviously aware. And
I should have been clearer, aside from Mr. Dunn, who was involved in the negotiation.
Our board chair, Ed Hurley, he was aware of the negotiations.
By the way, with respect to Mr. Hurley, he is the co-chairman of Wachtell-Lipton.
Yes.
Were they involved in providing legal advice?
Yes.
Were they representing you or advising you in the litigation?
Yes.
Mr. Dunn, you've been involved with business governance for, I would say, decades. Is it common to keep these kinds of negotiations secret from a corporation's governing body? Strikes me as remarkable.
Senator, every negotiation, every deal has its own rhythm. This framework agreement settled the litigation and then said, we're going to keep talking. We were really afraid that once the other side's lawyers learned anything about it, it would be poof, gone.
But most corporations trust their boards of directors. In fact, they're intimately involved. They're informed. One of your board has resigned because of this breach of common trust and practice. Wouldn't you say this is pretty unique in your experience?
What I would say, Senator, was that the conversations, I think, were fragile. And I really felt that on the Saturday, I guess it's Memorial Day, I thought they were over, frankly. And we did have a discussion earlier on where I mentioned to the chairman and to the commissioner, I said that, we ought to do this, and the chairman said that that's the commissioner's decision, and the commissioner said, we'll decide when we decide. And my understanding is he had the authority to sign the agreement, which is simply terminates the lawsuit, and then with the knowledge that everything else was going to have to be discussed after that. Now, that's all I can say about that. That's all I know about that.
But you would agree that most corporations, most executives, CEOs feel a duty. In fact, I would argue that legally as well as morally, they have a duty to keep their boards of directors informed. Why this near unique secrecy with your own board of directors? Simply you didn't trust them.
You know, Senator, I've been to 2 board meetings. I started in, I started in January. So I was not an expert on the dynamic of the board, very honestly.
The bed was on fire when you got into it.
No, LIV put us on fire. LIV put us in an incredibly difficult position. LIV was a constant every day, who's going to go? It was very disruptive.
I'm going to come back to LIV's disruptive effect when I return. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to vote. We have a vote ongoing right now, and I apologize. I will have some additional questions. When I come back, I'm going to turn to the ranking member, and I'll be back. We're in the middle of a vote right now. I'll be back within a matter of a few minutes.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before you go, I mean, did the board object to the fact that the lawsuit was dismissed? I mean, once it was finally revealed, did anybody on the board say, hey, this is awful, we should continue to engage in this legal action?
The one, no, they did not. The reality was, in fact, Mr. Stevenson described it to me as like that this is just a litigation settlement. There's really not much to this. That's what, but he was not happy about not knowing about it.
And again,
you got to ask him.
We can emphasize again, there is no deal.
There's no deal. There's no agreement. There's a settlement of the lawsuit, and we're talking, and we're trying to see if we could do something that makes sense for our players, sponsors, fans. That's what we're trying to do. Really hard.
And this is not making it any easier. I mean, let's be honest. This is not making your job any easier.
Well, if you're addressing me, Senator, you know, Ron is doing the negotiation, and the fact,
Price.
but he being here in Washington, worrying about this, consumed with this, no, it's making it a lot harder, a lot harder.
So, I mean, I can say some things, but the chairman's not here to hear them. But I'll say them anyway. From my viewpoint, I don't see the PGA as doing anything wrong here. And unfortunately, from some of my colleagues, the line of their questioning implies that there's something nefarious or something wrong, or that you violated, you know, for example, your duty to the board. Can you just address that? Mr. Price, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Senator. No, certainly from our point of view, we faced an existential threat, as you indicated earlier. Our sole purpose was to preserve our existence so that we could continue to benefit our constituents, our players, and charity, and our ability to continue to lead professional golf, and as a result, get in a position of where LIV Golf was not leading professional golf and controlling golf for its operations. And the negotiations were confidential, so that surprised a lot of people. And that was, unfortunate that we had to surprise people, but it was necessary. As Jimmy has said, or otherwise, the deal we would not have been able to reach an agreement.
And by the way, I fully understand that had the other side's lawyers gotten wind of this, again, they would have seen, a bunch of legal fees just going up in smoke, right? And they would have done everything possible to tank the dismissal of the lawsuit, because there's no deal. There's a framework, but the only thing definitive is you were able to get that legal liability off your plate, correct?
That's correct, Senator.
Now, there have been an awful lot of questions and comments, and you've been asked to give different assurances in terms of what the PGA Tour will do or won't do. I want to give you the opportunity, well, nobody else here at the dais, describe what the tour actually is. Who your duty is to. What your duty is not. I mean, obviously, you're human beings. You don't like to see repressive regimes. From a business standpoint, you've got a way, if you involve yourself in a country that's doing things that maybe your fan base wouldn't approve of, I mean, you'd have to certainly, factor that into your decision whether or not you hold a tournament somewhere or not.
Correct.
Mr. Dunn, you talked about, I think very convincingly, that you love this game of golf. You think that golf can help repair breaches, right?
Yes.
Well, talk a little bit about just the game of golf being able to use globally. Again, we talked about meritocracy. There doesn't make any difference what kind of race you are. Literally, it doesn't make any difference. If you can shoot a lower score than anybody else, you're going to be competing at the highest level. But just talk about what you think the game of golf can do for the world.
Well, I'm very, very jaded on this, but I have a tremendous respect and appreciation and love for the game of golf. Just in the world prospect, and I know there's been a lot of discussion about 9/11 and involvement, but there's 30. If you look at even in Saudi Arabia, I think there are 18 million young men and Saudi women that are under the age 32, and I think it would be good if they didn't think every American hated them, because they had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. And I think that golf can be a force throughout the world. Now, with respect to that, Senator, we would not be negotiating with them. They wouldn't have been the first pick. But first of all, we didn't need money.
You didn't choose.
No. We got to the table because of the situation at hand, which is the vulnerability to the tour. And the tour, one thing that's really come out, and it's very important, is the top 50 at the tour at that moment are critical to the viability of the tour and what it will be going forward. So if you lose a number of those players, sponsors become very unhappy. You don't have the level of competition. We would like the best players playing against each other all the time. We'd like to be able to have that product, but still protect the inches of the tour. So there are just so many things that we could do correctly if we could have the game united in level of competition. I think the competition could go up so level, the interest could go up so much, and you could see situations like it wasn't a tour event, but in the U.S. Open. Now, a guy won that tournament that it was amazing how he was able to do that. And it's just something special and unique.
But I would say, and again, it was just fun watching Wyndham Clark.
Oh, he was awesome.
Okay, I mean, he's got to keep it all together until he sinks that final putt, and then you see the tension flow out of him. But the fact of the matter is, had it been a bunch of players whose nobody knew their name, it might have been the U.S. Open. People still might have tuned in, but if it had been another tournament, you wouldn't have had the viewership, you wouldn't have had the audience, you wouldn't have had the revenue, you wouldn't have attracted the sponsor, and week in and week out, if that's what the PGA Tour looks like, just a lesser tour, without the stars, and that hurts everybody in the games of golf, except for the Saudis who have an unlimited bank account that want to buy their way into the game of golf. I mean, that's the reality you faced.
Senator, I've competed in business my whole life, and generally there are economic principles that make sense that you have to apply. And within that framework, you better get smarter, you better get tougher, you've got to get more knowledgeable, you got to work harder, you got to do all the things that frankly have made America great. This situation is different. To give a charity $50 million, it takes a lot of work to create that. It's a very different deal here. And if you
Let's, Mr. Price, let's talk about the progression of the game of golf. I mean, the stars of yesteryear made a fraction of what
Yes.
stars today are, right?
Correct.
So I'd like to, the 1.5 billion, I mean, people use that term like that's just a lot of money, and it is, but that's revenue. You have expense behind that.
Correct.
Okay, so talk about how the 1.5 million in general, I mean, just, gross terms, how you generate the 1.5 million revenue, the TV revenue, what you get from tournaments when you sanction the events. I mean, just tell us a little bit how what the revenue stream is, how difficult it is to bring in that revenue stream year in and year out, how you've grown that over the decades, how prize money has increased, and, quite honestly, how you had to increase dramatically the prize money to retain the players under the threat of LIV. I mean, that also put the tour's ability to fund this stuff at risk. But just kind of describe the business model.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Senator. Our business model is predicated on media revenues and sponsorship revenues, and that drives over 80% of our gross revenues. We have some other form of revenues, admissions, hospitalities at tournaments, licensing revenues, our tournament players clubs, but it's primarily predicated on media and sponsorship.
And by the way, the same media could pay for viewership rights for the other tours.
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
And they do to a certain extent, but not at the level that the PGA Tour garners.
That's correct. And, and they're trusting us when they enter into those agreements that we're going to deliver an excellent field of players to them, and it's going to include our top players or a strong representation of our top players. And so we've had some loyal players. We've had a strong group of loyal players that have remained with us, and we're very proud of that. And as we talked about earlier, we're going to make sure those players are recognized. But if LIV stays in existence and continues to take our top players from us, that will put pressure on our ability to retain those media revenues and those sponsorship revenues. They could decline in the future if LIV, that is the existential threat. And if they decline, it declines the earnings opportunities not only for those top players, but for all players. That's the threat that we faced, and that's what we're trying to work through.
Yeah, again, that's the existential threat the
Yes,
tour still faces. You need to understand that. This threat has not gone away.
That's correct.
Mr. Dunn, just speculate. If you're not able to conclude this deal, and by the way, this thing has to be concluded by the end of this year, correct? Or else, again, the lawsuits aren't reinitiated,
That's correct.
but LIV can, once again, re-engage in trying to attract more and more players and continue to build their tour at the expense of the PGA Tour. I mean, you just kind of talk about what's going through the players' minds right now.
Well, understandably, the players were shocked, and the real problem was the initial announcement. What should have been said is, LIV and the PGA Tour have agreed to settle their lawsuits. They're terminated with prejudice, so we win. We win those cases, and they agree to have discussions where PIF could be an investor, a minority investor, in potentially an ongoing entity. That would have been great.
Just real quick, though, you didn't really have a choice whether or not you could announce this. I mean, the lawsuits are going to be dismissed. That was going to be a public court filing.
Right.
So you had to make an announcement.
Well,
We kind of acknowledged the fact that you maybe didn't make the announcement the way you would have liked, so people started speculating.
That's right.
Like you had a hard deal here, but you don't have a hard deal.
We have no agreement. We have agreement to possibly get to an agreement. So I think the way it was announced, which was really bad, okay, everybody jumped to a conclusion, maybe even this body, that, they're selling to the, we're not, but we are really trying to figure out the right thing to do for our players and the global game of golf. And by the way, we'll try hard to get an agreement, and I'm hopeful that we will. If we don't, we'll have to go through some other we'll have to accept that we're going to have to go back and compete, and we'll have to do it, and we'll do it.
By the way, I've got a great deal of interest in this, and so I've been following the news pretty carefully. I've certainly sensed a softening, at least by some players, after they got over the initial shock, when they start realizing the situation you're in, and how you're trying to preserve what's in their best interest, the game of golf. Is that
Well, they
accurate
said
statement?
that sunlight is the greatest disinfectant. I mean, that when the facts come out, and, in hindsight, I wish we had put and we couldn't because you're not allowed to do it, but I wish we had put the agreement out day one and everybody could see that there's no there.
Right.
And I think, Ron, you might have said at the player meeting we were both at in a couple weeks ago in Connecticut, that if we had just announced what it was, it would have been fine. But, everybody's to blame for that. I'll take my share of blame for that, too.
I wouldn't beat up on yourself too bad on that. There's been a lot made of that tentative disparagement clause. First of all, Mr. Dunn, you've done a lot of deals. That's not unusual to have an anti-disparagement clause in any agreement, right?
Senator, it is very common because it's hard to get an agreement with someone if you're saying bad things about them by the pendency of the agreement. I understand the sensitivity to it, and I think it's worth consideration, and I applaud Senator Blumenthal for raising it because, in this country, we believe in free speech, and we do. This has a very short term. If we'll get to a deal, terrific. If we don't, it's gone.
By the way, there's nothing the PGA Tour can do to bind players to a disparagement. I mean, they've got freedom of speech, correct? I'm not even sure there's anything you can do to bind certain members of the board. I mean, you might be able to bind the organization not from issuing public releases. I mean, Mr. Price, what is your understanding of really what would be the enforceability of any anti-disparagement or disparagement clause?
We do not plan to enforce anything against our players for speaking their mind. They're free to speak their mind.
But again, I mean, how enforceable would it be against any member of the board or individuals as opposed to the organization?
I'm not an attorney, but, I would think board members are free to speak their mind.
Okay. Well, Mr. Chairman, I just took this opportunity to give the representatives of the PGA here a little chance to, once again, highlight the reality situations, some of their business model, how they generate revenue, how crucial it is that they're able to retain the top players and this thing doesn't splinter off to two separate tours. I thought they did a good job doing that, so I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks. Thanks, Senator Johnson. Thinking a little bit about some of your responses on the way over to vote and back. First, thanks to Mr. Dunn for understanding the concerns that I have raised. I guess my feeling is these are concerns about free expression. They're concerns about players and about your fans, about the game that you so dearly love. Isn't it better to have these concerns aired before you're locked into an agreement?
Senator Blumenthal, I'm a grateful American citizen. If you ask me to come and see, I'm going to come and answer all your questions. Whatever you say, I'm happy to answer any questions and work the best I can to help the PGA Tour and help the game of golf and help what we're doing.
Better to know what the concerns of the American people are before you are straitjacketed and locked into an agreement that may, in fact, unfairly and even illegally bind you, your players, sponsors, and others.
Senator Blumenthal, we appreciate everybody's interest and appreciate your involvement and thank you.
By the way, I cited the statement by John Rahm. I think the general feeling I'm quoting is that a lot of people feel a bit of betrayal from management. Have other players, Mr. Price, expressed those kinds of concerns to you?
Thank you, Senator. Due to the confidential nature of the settling the litigation and signing the framework agreement, we surprised a lot of people, including our players. So we've had a lot of work to do to make sure that our players understand what we did and why we did it. They're very interested in that. Our players are starting to understand why we did it. They're starting to see the significant benefits for them and the game of golf and all of our constituents if we can move from the framework agreement to the definitive agreement. But they're still very interested in the terms. They want to make sure we're in control.
Have you received anything in writing from any of the players?
I have not personally received anything.
Well, has the PGA Tour received anything in writing from any of the players?
I don't see everything that goes to our other executives, so I can't.
Are you aware of communications in writing from your players? We understand there have been.
There certainly could have been, yes, because
There could have
players
been.
were surprised.
Have you seen any?
No, I don't recall seeing any.
Have you heard about any?
You know, I've heard about a lot of discussions about players being surprised.
Could you make them available to this committee?
If they're written communications, we certainly will make those available.
Thank you. What would you say to the players who feel blindsided and betrayed?
Thank you, Senator. It's what we have been saying. We've been explaining why the negotiations had to be confidential and what the benefits were to entering into the framework agreement. And a lot of players, not all, are beginning to understand exactly why we had to do it and how this would be beneficial for them and charity and all of our constituents.
They're beginning to understand.
Yes, sir.
All of them?
Not all. We still have some work to do. Not all players agree on everything. We're a big membership organization and we represent a lot of different players.
How many players did you notify in advance of reaching the agreement?
I don't believe any players were
None?
notified. No, sir.
Not a single player was notified? You're a membership organization. Your members are the players. You don't exist without the players, but you didn't tell a single one of them about the negotiations, let alone what the result would be before you announced it publicly?
It was the settlement of litigation, which was binding, and then we've told the players that we would go through a process of making them fully involved in anything we do relative to the definitive agreement, which we're in the process of doing.
Mr. Dunn, you said in an interview, I think it was last year, quote, "If someone is willing to pay incredibly uneconomic prices, they will be unbelievably disruptive," end quote. You said that, I believe, correct?
Senator, I have the full faith that if you're saying it, it's right. I don't remember what it was a reference to, but it makes sense.
It seems to me that you were in effect saying there that the Saudis were willing to pay money without regard to the economic profit or revenue, correct?
Correct.
In other words, their interest was public image, sports washing, cleansing a reputation, correct?
Senator, I can't speak to the mind of what their intent was, but I know if you have a lot of something, you tend to be a little sloppier about it. So if you have...
They have a lot of money.
They got a lot. I mean, a lot. And so when you have, like, when it's like anything else, if you're down to your last $10, you watch it carefully. If you got...
And that's how they can be disruptive, because they got a lot of money, buckets full of money, correct? Because they don't have to care about the economic results. They're a total autocracy. They don't have to care about paying players. They'll just do it out of those buckets full of money, and that will continue with their dominant financial interests, their equity ownership of the PGA Tour through this profit-making entity that will control financially whatever the board of directors composition may be. So just looking at it from the future standpoint, you're not out of the woods. They're going to continue to have this kind of bucket full of money, and they're going to continue to kind of wield the influence that they do. That's the word that was used in the official documents. And whatever the good intentions and the rhetoric now, you still have to reach a deal. And so my hope is that you will resist those bucket full of money. I think a lot of players, a lot of sponsors, a lot of charities, and frankly, the 9/11 families are hoping that the PGA Tour will stand up and frankly avoid the sellout that this deal seems to be. Because that disruptive, uneconomic effect is exactly what we need to resist as a nation. If we're going to be selling out to countries that can throw around hundreds of billions of dollars, we're going to lose. Not just financially, we're going to lose in terms of our democracy and freedom. And institutions like golf, sports are central to our society, to our culture, to our economy, to our way of life, to our self-image, and our image abroad. And for all the reasons that you have very eloquently described your love of golf, it can't exist as an institution in this country if people are not willing to stand up for it, just like other sports and other institutions. You know, the 9/11 families, a number of them are here today, and they've asked for a meeting with you. Would you commit to meet with them?
Yes.
And do you have anything maybe that you'd want to say to them now, as long as a number of them are here?
Senator, I will say now what I said on September 12th of '01, what I said to my children growing up. Anyone remotely involved, anyone tangentially involved, anyone who profited, anyone who was involved, we should pursue them with extreme prejudice to the full extent, to the complete capacity. And over the years, I want to thank President Bush, I want to thank President Obama, I want to thank the magnificent United States military. I want to thank the special services that have executed that with prejudice. I honestly believe that our government, with both President Bush, President Obama, our military, and the brilliant, brilliant SEALs, did their job. And anyone that is involved with that thing has answered justice. I'd go on to say that with my own children, I thought it's been incredibly important to them to understand that because someone has the same skin color or the same religion as the people that were involved in, the criminals that were involved in 9/11, that doesn't mean we hate them. That we're raised in the United States of America that has different values, and we look at things differently. And when I grew up, in our house, we had a sign, "No Irish need apply." And that was something my mother instilled us, so that we just had a taste of what was that like when, because of religion or heritage, you didn't get something that you deserved. And I'm very proud that a friend of mine once said that my second son said that he had never, ever heard me say one negative remark about any Middle Eastern, any Muslim religion, anything like that. And I'm very proud of that. I think America stands for something different. I think if someone does a crime, you go after them. For this crime, it's death. I absolutely I believe that our special services did their job, and I'm grateful to them, but I will refuse to describe a whole nother people because they had common religion or skin color. I'm not doing that under any condition.
Thank you for those remarks. You know, I want to make clear that we're not here about the people of Saudi Arabia. We're here because the regime, an autocratic, repressive regime, is torturing, imprisoning, killing its own people because they are different and because they express their views or because they are women. And they have fostered the war in Yemen, and also there is mounting evidence, I think persuasive evidence, that the Saudi government was complicit in the 9/11 attack. And the families who are here are seeking justice against that regime. And the materials you've just been handed, which also went to Senator Johnson, I would suggest you have a look at. But the point is that the Senate actually has supported them. Senator Cornyn and I led the effort, it's called JASTA, to enable those families to go to court so that our courts would have jurisdiction in their quest for justice. We passed that bill, and then we passed it again when President Obama vetoed it. Senator Cornyn and I led that effort. And the materials that you've been handed reflect a lack of cooperation from some of the agencies in our own government in providing information that those 9/11 families need, seeking simple justice against Saudi Arabia. It's not the reason we're here today, but it reflects many of those reasons. So my hope is that you will support that effort of the families to seek justice. I'm glad that you are committed to meet with them, and the passion that you've expressed in support of our military and our other security services, because I think every member of the Senate shares those views, and it ought to bring us together. Senator Johnson, did you have any other questions?
My closing comments, first of all, is I do think this hearing has been constructive in a number of different ways. It's given the PGA Tour an opportunity to, you know, describe the rock and the hard place they were between and still are in, okay? This has got a long way to go, but many senators were able to express their concerns that I think the PGA Tour shares, so I think that was good. I would push back on the term sellout. PGA Tour did not seek this. They were put in this position. The Saudis have the $700 billion. If they want to be involved in golf, they will be involved in golf. And if this thing fails, they can spend the money to take over golf. And I think that'd be tragic, and I think it would destroy golf because it would destroy the competitive spirit and the purity of the competition. So I appreciate the difficult nature of you know, what you did, Mr. Dunn, in first reaching out and starting it. I understand the difficult nature of your task ahead of you, Mr. Price, to conclude this negotiation. I really do hope that we can give them this time and space and the privacy, working with their members, now that the members are fully aware of where they're going, to conclude this deal. And I think there's a real potential here. Again, this has been negotiated by somebody who, I guess, other than losing a direct member of the family, I mean, losing 40% of your colleagues is no small thing. You understand the full sensitivities. I don't think Mr. Dunn would be involved with people that had any involvement whatsoever. So I trust his judgment from that standpoint. And I hope we can, I guess, trust these individuals to do right by their members, by this country, by the 9/11 families, try and preserve the game of golf, competition at the highest levels, and see if we can't forge some kind of win-win situation where even the citizens of Saudi Arabia can enjoy greater freedom, greater modernity, where the game of golf can be used, as I know Mr. Dunn believes it really can be used, to bridge divides and just improve the situation. So again, I wouldn't have held this hearing. I was highly interested in attending it and listening to it. I think some good has come of it. I think it's been constructive, so I appreciate that. And let's give them the time and space to conclude a deal that can be actually a win-win situation for everybody involved.
We appreciate your being here. Thank you, Senator Johnson. We've learned a lot, and we've also learned we need to learn more. And so we're going to continue this inquiry. We're going to ask that the other potential witnesses that we invited actually come and share their perspectives and information. I assume you would support that effort?
You're talking about Yasa and yeah,
Yes.
I'm here.
Thank you. The more we know, the more we can support the values and freedoms that we have espoused here today and the ideals of professional golf and the PGA Tour, which we supported. I supported. When you asked me to meet in Cromwell, Connecticut, I was all in.
Yes, you were. Thank you for that.
And I will continue to support the PGA Tour. Just make no mistake, as I said before, America is on your side. We will support you. It shouldn't be about the money, the disruption, the uneconomic offers. And so I recognize that you can't say you're going to walk away from this deal, but I hope you bargain hard. And we will continue this inquiry because I think uncovering more of the facts and shining a spotlight on what's really happening here is in the national interest and part of our obligation. Thank you very much. This hearing is
Thank you.
going to
Thank
be,
you both.
is going to be adjourned, and the record will remain open for 2 weeks for any written questions that are submitted, the responses to Senator Hawley, and responses to other questions. And again, we're very grateful to you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.